G'day, mate. 40 here. I want to do a blog post on what are real, genuine moral categories and what are fraudulent, fake, pseudo-moral categories. So I think things like loyalty, respect for your parents, right? Sexual discipline, fidelity, that these would be like loyalty, genuine moral categories, as opposed to concepts such as racism and imperialism and colonialism, which are pseudo-moral categories. But I guess what's a real moral category and what's a pseudo-moral category comes down to the nature of your hero system. So I want to research what are traditional moral categories, right? As someone on the right, I think that those methods that are time-tested, right, they're much more likely to be real and genuine as opposed to the newfangled moral categories. So that's a topic I want to delve into at a future date. What are the real moral categories? What are the false moral categories? All right, you might just be depressed if you're not excited about Steve Saylor getting interviewed by Tucker Carlson. All right, if that doesn't excite you, then you've got a depression problem. I mean, how amazing is this? Steve Saylor ends up on Tucker Carlson's show.
Signed up for conferences. The last speech I gave in 2013 was an analysis of the Obama versus Romney exit polls. Didn't seem all that controversial to me.
No.
But for the next decade, every time I'd be invited to a conference, and about 6 weeks later, I'd get an email going, well, it turned out the SPLC or Media Matters went to the hotel and said that this is just deplorable. And you might find also that the local Antifa, the Black Bloc guys, were thinking about protesting and, how that can turn into violence and so forth. So they canceled their contract. So, I just kept writing, but all of a sudden the ice started to break up maybe last year. And this year I've been traveling around the country and meeting people who've been reading me for years or just started reading me. It's a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
It's just funny though, because, in a world where there are some wackos and there are people who advocate violence, you would seem to be maybe the last person who would scare people. I mean,
so could Tucker Carlson interview Steve Saylor if he was still on Fox News? No way. There'd just be too much pressure against Fox News advertisers.
You're effectively an informal academic or social scientist. You're a numbers guy.
Yeah, I'm kind of like Bill James, the baseball statistics analyst for the social sciences in the U.S. For 3 years now, I've been raising a stink about, all right, what was the impact of Black Lives Matter on Black lives? And as far as I can tell, it's got Black Lives Matter during the two eras of triumph after Ferguson in 2015-16, and then the big one during the Floyd effect, the racial reckoning of the 2020s. They've got an incremental 15 to 20,000 extra Black lives murdered through incremental homicides versus the baseline, or just splattered on the pavement through increased traffic fatalities.
But so all killed by white cops?
No. The vast majority of Black shooting deaths is at the hands of other Blacks. There was for example, in 2020, there was just an enormous explosion in mass shootings with at least 4 dead or wounded at Black social events. This is, we talk about mass shootings a lot, but as the New York Times did a big study in 2016 and concluded that almost 75% of the mass shootings with at least 4 victims, wounded or killed, take place in Black on Black events, typically Saturday night at the club or a funeral. Some of them are organized crime, very strategic, like in the TV show The Wire, but a lot is just one guy disses another guy and people pull out guns and start shooting. And yet that's of very little interest to the Democratic establishment, the need for what I call point of use gun control. the Democrats tend to obsess over the need for point of sale gun control to keep rednecks out in the country from buying rifles, legally buying rifles at Walmart. And in truth, what we've seen, like in the 1990s into the 2010s in New York City, where people like Giuliani, Bloomberg, and Braden did a great job of bringing down the murder rate.
Okay, so yesterday I was talking about the battle for Pico Robertson, the brawl that went on outside the Adas Torah synagogue, and I thought, my God, this community doesn't have control of its women because they're beautiful, young, attractive women, like getting right into the middle of the brawl, which is an incredibly self-destructive, dangerous thing for women to do. Women are much more physically vulnerable. They bruise easier, they break easier, they are just more physically vulnerable to getting punched or shoved or hurt. And I was thinking, come on, we want to protect our women. We don't want our women there on the front lines. But then I'm also thinking that this incident shows that our women don't have a good hold of our men. So I was just thinking out loud, oh man, people are going to be outraged hearing me say that the Jewish community doesn't have a good hold on its women. But Jewish women don't have a good hold on their men, that each sex tends to have particular power and influence over the other sex in completely different ways. So I would want women to influence their men to not gratuitously risk their lives, risk their health, risk their social standing by, for example, pouring out public slurs that can get videotaped and can get recorded and played, and it ruins your future. If you cared about your little brother, all right, would you want him to get damaged in a riot like this? So one of the healthy things of belonging to an in-group is that there should be some sense that you feel like every member of your in-group is your part of your extended family. So just like you wouldn't want your little brother getting hurt in these kind of protests, and you definitely wouldn't want your little sister getting hurt in these protests, you also wouldn't want your niece or nephew getting hurt. And so too, you take the same attitude towards any young Jew who's vulnerable and unnecessarily getting into brawls. You would want to protect their well-being. And so I think that's a healthy and a productive use of strong in-group identity, that you look at the people who are a bit younger than you and it's like, this is my little brother. I don't want them getting damaged in a senseless brawl, right? You have far more valuable things to do than getting into a senseless brawl, my young brother. And you'd feel bad. You'd feel bad for them, because you recognize that the type of person who would get into a brawl is only someone who's got nothing to lose, right? Someone who doesn't have a spouse, doesn't have kids, doesn't have a flourishing academic or educational or professional career. It doesn't have people depending on them. Only someone who has so little value of his own life would throw himself needlessly into a senseless brawl. Dooovid, anything that I was just saying that you want to comment on?
Yeah, definitely. Although, just first, you knew Steve Saylor, right? You were in professional social circles with him.
I don't know him personally, but I certainly know who he is.
Okay, maybe it's someone else. Yeah, I like the direction you're going. Although, like I mentioned the other day, because I'm doing a lot of research into psychology, and just recently, I did a big research and stream on American pragmatism, and I said, like, the philosophy of America is pragmatism, with the main names like Charles Sanders Peirce and William James, John Dewey, George Herbert Mead. And in psychology, there's three main theories of identity, and we've discussed the narrative identity at length. But the other two main theories of identity are role theory and trait theory. A role theory is that, like George Herbert Mead, that there's society conditions us and develops certain roles for us, and our identity is based on interaction with other people that becomes kind of rehearsed for roles. And like William James says, a man has as many social selves as there are people that recognize him. And the other theory is trait theory, where just like identity is based on certain personality traits that a person has largely consistently across their lifetime. And narrative identity theory is more recent. So I'm not sure within the academic literature how your hero system would fit in. Is that a form of role identity theory or trait theory?
It has absolutely. It has nothing to do with what I asked you. I asked you a very simple, direct question. I was talking about the healthy use of in-group identity and seeing members of your group needlessly put themselves at risk. One would wish that they would make other choices, and one would feel sad that they feel that they have so little going for them that that they would needlessly risk their well-being in a senseless brawl. So I asked you a very specific question, and you've gone on about narrative identity at great length many times on this stream. I asked you a very direct question. Was there anything I said about in-group identity taking a sense of not ownership, but a sense of care and consideration, that viewing members of your in-group as a part of your extended family? And I would contend that this is a healthy way to go through life, and then feeling sad that people would have so little invested in their own life that they would needlessly risk it. Was there anything on that specific matter, before you go off on 15 other tangents, is there anything on that specifically that you would like to comment on?
Yeah, because I think it depends, and there's not necessarily a single way to analyze it, because you could have strong in-group identity but value certain characteristics like courage and sacrifice, where the suffering of your people is diminished according to those values. So, so if you value honor, sacrifice, courage, and then you see your friends suffering and dying, you say you're not as worried, you're more proud that they exemplified those characteristics, as opposed to there could be other characteristics that you might value. And I mean, in-group identity also has its limits. If you say, like, okay, the Jewish people has millions of people. Just in Los Angeles, there's hundreds of thousands of Jews, and you might be able to mourn or identify with like every single Jew who is a victim of anti-Semitism. But at some point, in-group identity has its limits to family, friends, close community, to the maybe concentric circles, and at some point you're going to have conflict between like a distant member of the Jewish community you don't know versus maybe like a non-Jew you do actually know, and so I think it's going to be hard to delineate a clear answer to that.
Okay, so I'm talking about people you see right in front of you, people who you're acquainted with, or that you know better than just at an acquaintance level. And I think a normal, natural, healthy in-group identity there would be feeling bad that they're needlessly risking their own well-being. Now, what about the point that anyone who is getting into a senseless brawl has nothing going on in their life worth protecting, and how sad that is?
Well, I mean, what about if your hero system includes certain things like sacrifice, martyrdom, courage, bravery? How is that going to conflict with you say, I would rather have my close friend die a horrible death in a case of courage and bravery than him being coward and run?
Well, I kept using the word senseless, so you're not using the word senseless. So I don't know what hero system would glorify someone senselessly throwing their life away, but you certainly wouldn't find it within Judaism. So I'm talking very specific. In Judaism, you're not going to find a lot of hero systems that say, hey, throw your life away for senseless reasons.
Well, of course you would, because like Zionism.
You would. Zionism would
Zionism
say...
is senseless.
Senseless, absolutely senseless.
Is senseless.
Absolutely senseless. So Israelis who want to live, absolutely senseless for them to want to live.
Well, I mean, it's a dispute. So you could argue that Zionism or the war in Gaza is senseless, but it's like some Jews feel that way, others don't. So here you have that, like most Jews feel that the war in Gaza is honorable, and they have more respect for the brave soldiers than for the Haredim. Even though, like, I could argue, like, no, you're dying for nothing. Not only that, you're ruining the good reputation of Judaism, and you're not even helping the safety of Judaism. I mean, but I mean, we don't have to debate that specific issue, but I mean, I think that you would agree it's debatable. And then here you're saying, here you're actually more valuing what I was mentioning, like courage, bravery, sacrifice, than safety.
Well, I was very clear. I'm talking about senseless, senseless. And so, will you just oppose anything I say because that's just your personality? I mean, that's fine. I don't know how anyone could defend the senseless throwing away of your own life.
Well, because that's subjective, senseless. So that means to argue. So I'm just
Well,
saying,
to
if
have a
I
discussion, we have to set things up with a parameter. I use the parameter senseless, and you want to escape that parameter. I don't know how you would argue, but you will. If I say 2 + 2 = 4, you're going to say, well, in a different hero system, it's really 5.
Well, I mean, I think case in point is where we do have a lot of deaths. Like there's been over 315 Jews who've been killed in the war since October 7th, and thousands have faced injuries, many of them grievous. And it's I mean, you could say you think it's completely clear without argument whether this war in Gaza is senseless.
I wasn't trying to talk about Gaza. I was talking about people senselessly throwing away their lives, but you won't confront that issue. So whatever, I give
I'm
up.
confronting it because I'm saying that, like, I mean, without an example. I mean, you just say, what's an example of
I gave
someone
an
senseless?
example. They were senselessly brawling outside of a synagogue. I've said it about 10 times now. A very specific example, senseless brawling outside a synagogue that just needlessly puts your own well-being at risk. I'm not going to just keep repeating it. So maybe there are some thoughts that you've developed
Well,
about
I agree with
what
you
happened.
in that, but I'm saying I don't think all Jews would agree that it was senseless, and I think that there are hero systems, probably among your neighbors and friends, that don't think that that was senseless.
I wasn't asking all Jews. I was asking you. I asked you, Dooovid, but I give up. I won't ask you anymore. I've asked you 12 times, and I can't get a straight answer. Maybe you've got some reflections on your own. Maybe I'll hear some of your points, because I'm just talking to a brick wall with regard to a couple of the points that were most important to me. So we're now, 2 days since the rumble on Pico Boulevard in the heart of Jewish community, Orthodox Jewish community, about a block or two outside of Beverly Hills. And I know you've been thinking about it. So nothing I said resonated with you today. Nothing I said made any sense to you whatsoever. So why don't you drop some thoughts on me? Have you had further reflections about what happened in Pico Robertson on Sunday with the brawling between the pro-Palestine and the pro-Israel crowds?
Yeah, I mean, because now at this point, it's past is done. You have to assess, without like the definitional regress of senseless or various interpretations, but say how at risk was the Jewish community? Was it a good or bad thing that Jews stood their ground? And the outcome now of the two perspectives, of the political perspective that makes Jews look like the victim and helpless, and now like a lot of pressure where now we need special protections, now we're going to get maybe more government grants to protect synagogues or police protection, or a whole bunch of powerful people are going to say sympathetic statements towards the Jews or over exaggerate the danger that we're in, versus some sort of reasonable assessment. Mentioned like in Metro Detroit, they have the Federation. Probably in LA also they have a group of probably security experts, IDF, police officers, wealthy people that have a legitimate assessment of the security needs of the Los Angeles Jewish community. So
yeah, I know there are a range of views. I asked you, do you have one? I mean, you just outlined like half a dozen different perspectives that people could take. But is there anything that you actually believe?
Yeah, I mean, my view is generally towards legitimate group conflict of interest, and that there has to be some sort of negotiation resolution around legitimate group conflict of interest. And here you have, with the war in Israel, you have a case of legitimate group conflict of interest that likely could spiral into violence. You have conflict of interest where certain aspects of the American community, the American Jewish community, are pushing America, to possibly go against their best interest in supporting Israel's action, and it escalates group conflict of interest that will likely be seen with further protests, further direct action against the Jewish community, let alone now where you said, like, you would call the senseless violence as an escalation. And now it's kind of, well, the wait and see. Are the pro-Palestinian people going to respond in kind with a typical tit for tat? Or are they going to be like, okay, like, we were wrong, we shouldn't have protested in synagogue, we got our licks, and we learned our lesson, we won't do that again.
Okay.
And that's just my style. Like, I'm not a prescriptive
Right,
type
I know
person.
that's your style. We already knew that. So, I mean, you don't have any new thoughts about this conflict. So let's just move on. You're just saying things that we already know. In Israel, the Israeli Supreme Court has ruled that the Israeli military must draft Haredi Jews. Any thoughts on this development?
Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising. Everyone knew it was coming, and now it's finally here. There might be some sort of bureaucratic holdups possible. So, I mean, it's not necessarily like it's going to happen right away. This was the largest reason in the Supreme Court, Netanyahu's plan to revamp the Supreme Court and take away their powers. It was up there with one of the big three reasons, to do it, which largely failed due to international pressure and the protests leading into the war. Obviously, it could lead to the dissolution of Netanyahu's majority. But I mean, it appears that they're going to make some sort of compromise where probably like the number I'm hearing right now is like 3,000 a year, even though the Supreme Court seemed to have ruled that all of those compromises aren't possible. It has to be all of them. It has to completely end the exemption. And I mean, Israel's in limbo right now. Israel's in a lot of trouble. And the nature of the Supreme Court, can the Supreme Court actually dictate policy? All they could do is say that the current policy is against the law, but they can't actually force a new policy. And then also, because the ruling coalition has to enforce the law of the Supreme Court. But I would expect to see some tiny level of compromise in number of thousands of Haredim maybe joining, some level of cooperation within the Netanyahu coalition of actually enforcing it, but then also pushback of breaking the coalition. And I don't know what's your analysis of it.
I don't know. It just it surprised me. I mean, it's something that I would intrinsically favor.
It's not something you knew was coming.
No, I didn't know it was coming. I think it's a great development in the sense that I knew it was going to have to come in the next 20 years if Israel was going to survive, but I didn't know it was coming this month. So
I mean, that was one of the things the Supreme Court was considering, and eventually they were going to rule on it. And everybody knew that the Supreme Court was going to rule that the Haredim were going to have to be drafted. I mean, in that sense, people who were following didn't have any doubt. Like at some point, could be any day, the Supreme Court was going to make this ruling.
Okay, I wasn't up to date on that. What do you think about the United States instituting a draft so that people either have to serve in the armed forces or have to do some kind of public service for 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say no chance. I mean, I'd say like I definitely would oppose that, and libertarian leaning. And I think the U.S. is falling apart anyways. But let alone that there could be consensus around a national identity. And the unfortunate Israeli national identity is really twofold. One is Haredi, where like the national identity is Israel's the Jewish state, and the Haredim are the quintessential example of what it means to be Jewish. And the other is basically safety and security, that Israel was created because the Holocaust, or because Jews aren't safe because of anti-Semitism, and therefore, in order to be safe, national identity is built upon people putting in their fair share. And so the majority Israel that is the national identity around military service, and how they see military service is, I would say, less so, from some like, it was basically like an unfortunate condition of the reality of being a Jew and the necessity for security and safety. So I don't think you would be able to find that in the U.S. Like, in order to build identity or some sort of purpose, you would have to have some sense of like, like, without it, we're all going to die. And I don't think you're legitimately going to be able to create a situation like that in the U.S.
Okay, Dooovid, if you got any further thoughts, throw them in the chat, and I'll bring you back a little later on the show. So I'm gonna move on for right now.
Yeah, God bless. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, thanks for coming by, Dooovid. Okay, just heartbreaking story in Foreign Policy magazine. You wouldn't expect heartbreaking stories in Foreign Policy magazine, but here's the headline. It just chokes me up because I've struggled with this. Loneliness is a national security crisis. So I often tend to have an exaggerated sense of my own importance. And when someone comes along online and kind of feeds into my exaggerated sense of importance, or someone in real life, all right, I am susceptible to being manipulated. And it's not just me, it's thousands of people who've been taken in by scams online. So loneliness is a national security crisis. Internet scams. All right, who do they target? They target vulnerable people. Who's vulnerable? Lonely people. Right? I've been God's lonely man at various times in my life. Right? Loneliness epidemic in the United States so bad that even federal agencies are paying attention. Half of adults report experiencing feelings of loneliness and isolation. And by the time you experience feelings of loneliness and isolation, that is a warning system, right? From your physiology. It's like, hey, what the heck? Something's going on here. This is dangerous for you. This is really bad for you. You're in a really bad place. It's not some trivial thing like indigestion, right? If you're feeling lonely, right, and you become conscious that you're feeling lonely, that's huge. That's dangerous. It's a giant warning system that your life is not on track, right? It's like, hey, pay attention. You got to do something about this. And to chronically feel lonely day in and day out, as most people in marginal movements are, that's a disaster, right? This goes on for weeks and months and then years, and for most of your life or all of your life, you feel loneliness. That is terrible for you, and it's terrible for society, because you are going to be incredibly vulnerable if you are lonely. All right, you're going to be vulnerable to extreme politics, to being taken in by cults, to be taken in by scams. All right, you're a sitting duck for something or someone who comes along and makes you feel whole, right? And that's how psychopaths work, right? They come along and they make you feel great, and then they hook you in with those good feelings, and they start using and abusing you. So we've got a painful social problem, because the more diverse we are, right, the less we have in common with each other. And the less we have in common with each other, the more lonely people get. And sure, the smart 115, 120 plus IQ people, they're doing pretty well in the United States of America, right? They're graduating from college, they're getting married, they're having kids. But those who don't have those cognitive skills, and even some with those cognitive skills, are not getting married and are lonely, are isolated, and are vulnerable to cults, to extremism, and to scams. So this article's written by a woman who specializes in matters of online security, Natalia Antonova. Natalia Antonova. And she says, I get laughed at when I try to explain the national security threat of loneliness to old school bureaucrats. Like, who can blame them? Lib Medley says, long walk. I was starting to flag toward the top of the stretch when I see a young Mexican in a Gaza scarf campaigning for the local communist. I look him in the eye, and with a raised voice, I say, have you watched the Luke Ford show? But consider how easy it can be to compromise the lonely and the desperate. Right? If you're lonely, this is a big warning signal that something's really wrong. It's like you're having symptoms of a heart attack, right? You're having symptoms of going blind, right? You'd want to wake up and figure out what the heck is going on. right? Sweet Dave, right? That's his name among security professionals, otherwise known as David Franklin Slater, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel turned civilian Air Force employee, charged with passing on classified information to an individual claiming to be a woman and a Ukrainian via email and other online messaging platforms. Why did he do it? Because he was lonely and a woman came along and online and gave him attention. Right? He told this woman, "You are my secret informant, love." Right? He wanted to feel special. You want to feel special? Do you have a desperate yearning to feel special? Right? This could be so maladaptive that you start live streaming every day with your thoughts on the news. Right, so the person he was corresponding with made him feel like a hero, not just another retired soldier in Nebraska. Who doesn't want to feel like a hero? Right? We could be heroes just for one day. Everybody wants to feel like a hero, but if your longing to be a hero is 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, that's highly dysfunctional. Right? That is a really bad idea. Right? You're going to be making a lot of terrible decisions if you have an intense yearning to be a hero. Damn, Glib Medley says, I cannot walk and listen to 40 at the same time. I'm sorry that the cognitive level of this show is so demanding that walking above 4 miles an hour starts to interfere with one's capacity to properly appreciate the profound insights that are given to you on the 40 show. So it's easy to dismiss people like Slater as foolish and as horny, and definitely was. But you can unearth his Facebook likes. All right, he was just completely awash in images of unattainable fantasy women to an embarrassing level. So it would just make sense he would lose all common sense if approached by one online. So there got to be software programs that will monitor the social media posts of your employees or those who have national security interests. Because if you have national security interests and you're lonely, you are highly vulnerable to spilling the beans. When was the last time I had a kebab hero sandwich at Venice Beach? I am vegetarian, so I've never had a kebab sandwich, and I don't eat in non-kosher places. So sex, right? It's too discordant to walk and to listen to 40 at the same time. So it's not that the IQ level is too cognitively distracting. It's that I don't have the smooth, mellifluous tones of the more accomplished national broadcasters and live streamers, where you just feel a nice rhythm as you're listening to the host speak, and it just goes with your walk. Instead, I'm up here, then I'm down there, then there are long, awkward pauses, and then I'm yelling at Dooovid, and then I'm yelling at the chat, and then I'm yelling at myself, and it's just too discordant, right? It is not a good accompaniment for a walk. I listen to nothing at all. You normally listen to nothing at all when you walk, Glib? Wow. I would say 98% of the time when I am walking, not on Shabbos, all right, I am listening to something. All right, then we got Air National Guard member Jack Tahara, leaked highly classified information to impress his fellow nerds on Discord. Right, he wanted them to think of him as a badass. So you think if he had a normal level of connection, that he would have been eager to impress his fellow nerds on Discord to this degree? Wait, how can you be vegan and beef organ capsules? Right, I don't eat meat precisely because never said I was vegan, I'm vegetarian. And precisely because I am vegetarian and I don't take in meat through my diet, I have to supplement it by swallowing capsules. So it's like, oh, how can you say oral sex is not sex? Well, in the Torah tradition, oral sex is not sex. There is a substantive difference between oral sex and penetrative vaginal sex. And so I tell you, I don't eat meat. I have to swallow beef organ capsules to have a decent level of health. And then to some people, that'll sound like a contradiction, and to other people, it will make perfect sense. Foreign intelligence preys on the lonely and the vulnerable. Well, not just foreign intelligence. All forms of life prey on the vulnerable. Right? When you're looking to feed, right, you look for the vulnerable. If you're walking and giving off a vulnerable air, right, you're much more likely to get mugged. Right? We have all sorts of attractive women who have seduced men to drain them of their national security interest. Now the internet allows the illusion of connection, right? It facilitates exploitation on a scale we have never seen before. And it doesn't even take foreign actors, right? We got 2 Americans going on trial for charged with giving classified information to Russia. What does a married couple have to do with loneliness and fantasy worlds? Well, many married couples are terribly, terribly lonely. I remember years ago on the stepper at the Y, and the young woman next to me said, "How can you do that?" I said, "Pick your feet up." She says, "No, you don't have headphones on." Yeah, I would go crazy, right? My mind needs to be occupied. So I can't imagine going for a walk without listening to, usually I'll listen to a book, but sometimes I'll listen to a podcast. Okay, look at the power dynamics in this marriage, right? They were in a lopsided relationship with Gabriella submerged in a fantasy dream world of sacrificing everything for a distant mythical Russia. And so she pressured her spouse into going along with it. Right? She thought she could simply email the Russian embassy, offer them help, and then trust whoever reads emails from random strangers over there. All right? She called her spouse a coward for showing any hesitation about being a traitor to America. Right? There wasn't a financial motive. This was a spy fantasy concocted by a woman who wanted to feel important. Gordon Black, Staff Sergeant in the U.S. Army, was arrested in Russia in May, accused of theft. He was involved with a Russian woman in Vladivostok, right? And he was nabbed there. He's in the middle of a divorce from his American wife. Found pictures of him with the Russian woman in question, and she drained him of his interests, national security interests, right? She humiliated him. So Black decided to risk it all for a Russian woman, right? He was incredibly lonely and he was vulnerable. 40, don't you need time to think through, develop, refine your own thoughts? I do. And the best way I refine my own thoughts is by listening to other thoughts or by listening to music, or they just hit me. Often when I'm reading the newspaper, listening to a podcast, listening to a book, then the thoughts just start flowing in and start making notes on my phone. So all sorts of people with access to sensitive information, right, will give it away for the illusion of intimacy. Even music distracts me from writing. I understand that for some people, but I've had people tell me that the quality of my work was excellent, and I was listening to music 99% of the time. So I'm usually listening to music when I'm writing, when I'm thinking, when I'm making notes for the show, when I'm preparing for the show. So it's just national security that's at risk. All right, you are at risk if you're lonely, if you've got an intense need to be a hero, you've got an intense need to feel special. And what have we got going on here? Elliott Blatt, do you have a juicy story for us?
Yes. Hi, Luke. Can you hear me?
Yes, I know you can talk about this and you can talk about that, and there are some perspectives on this and other than that, but you have a juicy story for us, sir?
Juicy is a strong word, but it's a good story, I believe.
Blessings.
But it's going to be somewhat of a difficult story to tell because certain details I want to conceal because
Sure.
I don't feel as though it's appropriate to me.
Yeah, just give the spiritual truth. So feel free to adjust some factual details so we get the spiritual truth.
Okay. So as you know, we have a mutual acquaintance,
Yes.
and he's a bit of an under-earner.
Yes.
But it's very complicated sort. It's not like he's unintelligent or anything. It's not like he needs to be an under-earner, right? Highly intelligent, highly educated, highly competent. He actually earns quite a bit of money, but he lives a life that's incredibly self-sabotaging, and it's both destructive to him, but basically everybody he comes in contact with. He's the most complicated personality I've ever met, and which is fitting because I met him through you. So with that backdrop in place, I need to now unfurl the story.
Shall we call him Joe?
Let's call him Joe. So Joe has really taken a shine to me He sees me as a quasi, I don't want to say father figure, but he sees me as a sort of somewhat, I'm considerably older than he is. He sees me as a somewhat of a person with a little bit of wisdom to share, and therefore he he respects what I have to say, and my approval of him is important to him. So it's not like I have dominion over him, but he does very much value my opinion and seeks it out, and he likes sort of considering me a friend.
He's like Deep Left Jokel.
He's sort of like Deep Left Jokel, but Deep Left Jokel is considerably more refined in this character than Joe.
Yeah.
Okay. So Joe, over the months, occasionally, so he'll just show up at my apartment and he's got like a woman to show me.
Great.
So he brings over a woman to my apartment, and he knows that when he shows up at my apartment at the right time, I'm generally making dinner, and I'll generally, share a little bit of the dinner that I prepared. And, he's sort of part of like the under earner sort of mind space is like this poverty mindset.
Yes.
And he's sort of always like, a free meal is a free
Yes.
meal,
Yeah,
and
looking
he's
for
gonna
freebies. Yeah.
he's gonna eat as much as he can
Yeah.
if it's offered to him. So there's a sort of uneconomic incentive that sort of underlies his affinity to me. So this is all part of the background. So just so imagine every now and again he shows up and he's got this woman with him. Now this woman is generally not exactly a catch. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's like SMV3 or below. You know what I mean?
Yep. How
It's
old
like,
is she?
Generally 30-ish.
Okay.
Maybe a little above, maybe a little below. But generally speaking, not attractive.
Yep.
Incredibly not attractive, right?
Yep.
But he sort of manages to see something in her or something, and sort of he likes to introduce these women to me because I sort of confer some sort of legitimacy on him. I'm sort of his sort of wingman, as it were, for lack of a better term. He's trying to sort of show that he knows stable people or semi-stable people, and at least in his eyes, I'm somewhat
My God. Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So you just have to understand that this sort of dynamic just kind of has unfolded over the years without any active participation from me. And I don't actively precipitate, but I don't actively shut it down like I ought to, right? Because, it's like, as we've discussed in the past, I don't exactly know where appropriate boundaries are,
Yes.
and push comes to shove, I sort of err towards the side of leniency, and I'm more inclined to say yes than I am to say no. And given my history, saying no is often the better course. But
yeah,
we
I've dated a lot of women. I've dated a lot of women like you.
Really now?
Yeah.
That's scary.
They don't like to say no.
Okay. So I'm going to advance the story a little bit here. So this goes on month after month, every month or so, new woman, new set of pathologies, generally unbelievably unattractive. And they're people that I just basically never want to see again, right? And then, like 2 months ago, he shows up and he's got this other woman. And I say, listen, I don't want you bringing any more fucking drug addicts into my apartment. I don't want to meet these
Yeah.
people. I don't want to know these people. They sap my soul. It's just not what I'm into. And he's like, no, this one's different. She's incredibly beautiful. And I'm like, really? And he's like, yes. All right. And so I say, okay. All right. Bring her by. And so he comes by, and he brings this woman here that's absolutely stunning. I mean, stunning.
Wow. Wow.
Like 9.5 plus. I
wow.
mean, stunning. And not only that, she's Ivy League educated. She's fluent in like German and French and possibly Italian, and maybe even Russian. She's got like this galaxy brain IQ. And she's with me. She's in my apartment with Joe, who basically lives in his car.
What the hell? How does this happen?
How does this happen, Luke? This doesn't happen in real life. So I'm basically in Alan Funt mode here, like waiting for somebody to like, say the joke is up. This is like just not natural, right? This doesn't happen in the real world. And there she is. She's in my apartment. And we're talking and we're speaking a little French. I speak a little French, not fluent, but I can speak some French. And like, this is just like an unbelievable development, Luke. And I'm like,
yeah, wow.
So I make dinner. I make dinner for Joe, for her. We have a dinner. We sit down. We have a little wine. We have a very nice dinner. We have chit chat. We talk about, investments and trading and all IQ stuff, like intergalactic IQ stuff. I'm saying,
soul connection.
How can this really happen? This doesn't happen to people like me, right? I mean, look, at my best day at my age, I'm a 6 on my best day. Right? And we're talking about like a 9 plus here. I mean, she's got this look like she's like a ballerina, and she has this energy, this like angelic aura about her,
Yeah.
And I'm like, I wasn't ready for this, bro, And so I'm thinking, okay, this is a one-off. I can deal with this. I know this ship is sailing, right? So like, don't get too attached to it. Enjoy it while it's here, right? And then I'm like, expecting this whole thing to sort of dissolve. And then I'm expecting my normal mediocrity, my normal mediocre life to sort of resume its course, right? And then, we say our goodbyes and so forth. And I figure, this little brush with greatness is bound to be over with, right? And then, so a couple days later, I like open up the door to my apartment, and there's like a brown paper bag on my doormat, and it's got like all kinds of baked goods. And I'm like,
nice.
What the hell is this, right? And I'm like, I open up the door, and, I look in there, there's some baked goods, and I'm like, what the fuck? How does this happen?
Wow.
She like dropped off some blueberry muffins for me.
My God.
Can you fathom this, Lee? So basically we're talking about like a 1 in a million shot. Now it's like 1 in a big shot. Like, hot women don't drop off baked goods at my apartment on a regular basis, Lee. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
I mean, aside from the time that I had them delivered.
Okay. And so I'm like, I mean, she's like 15 years younger than me, at least, right? And like there's nothing that can really have come of this. But nevertheless, these thoughts start flooding my mind.
Of course, you're only human.
I'm
You're
only
not a
human,
saint.
bro. And like my whole so basically my whole world is like
Yeah.
incredibly
Turned
turned
upside
upside
down.
down, right?
Wow. Yeah,
Like,
I would be.
like because I'm in the normal load, but I go to Costco and I see 400-pound woman in mobility scooters, right?
Yeah.
This is the sort of normal is it Stern and Drome or something? How's it?
Yeah, Sturm and Drang. Yeah, that's the normal thing. Okay, so keep going.
Okay, so I'm like, okay, I need to be sober about this. I can't start having like fantasies. She's totally my wife material. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Totally. Like, it is, and yet I'm like, how can this be? Why isn't she married now? Right?
Yeah.
Like, this is like quality at a level that's you don't encounter often, right? And so I'm like, oh God, what pressure. Like, how do I process this? How do I this, and it turns out she's like 2 blocks away from me.
Ah.
We're basically neighbors, dude. We're neighbors for all intents and purposes, right? And so, and like this, and like, oh, these thoughts are flooding in, and like, I'm having dreams. I'm like, is this real? Could this be true? Could this be happening? Do I need to go? Do I make a move? Is this appropriate? Is this even in the realm of possibility? There's something wrong here. Like, I'm having this Alan Funt fears about all of this, right?
Yeah.
And like, so we chit chat, and so she's okay. I gotta point this out, and I discovered she likes to drink.
Okay. I mean,
Right?
we all.
And I like to drink too.
Yeah.
I like to drink too, but it's just
You like
weird,
to drink. You guys would be perfect for each other.
It's like, yeah, exactly. It's another aspect. It's like, but at the same time, it's kind of a red flag.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's
Depending
kind
on
of a
how
red
much
flag.
she drinks.
Right. But so we have drinks, we chit chat and so forth, and I'm enjoying this. Part of me is sort of not believing it's happening, kind of thing, And eventually, she invites me over to. So she lives with her mother, and she invites me over to like a little party night, a little soiree.
Nice.
With me, her mother, and this other woman. And
Nice.
So this is like 2 weeks ago. So we have this little dinner party, right?
Yeah.
And so you got her, who's, let's just, for all intents, but let's just use numbers here.
Yeah.
We got like this 10, right?
Yeah.
Then you got her mother, who was obviously very attractive, because I saw pictures of her when she was young. She was very attractive in her day, but time takes its toll. And so charitably, she's a 2 now. Right?
Yeah.
And then there's this other woman who's a friend of the mother, who kind of looks like Lizzo. Right?
Oh, God. That's
she's basically
weird.
a 0.
Oh.
Right? So I got like a 0, a 2, and a 10. Right?
What the hell? That's
And
weird.
then I'm at
You've
dinner.
got a nice personality. Yeah.
Yeah. But I have to pretend that they're all the same, right?
Equally worthy of your attention.
They're all 5s, right?
Yeah.
So I'm having this immense cognitive load that I'm trying to okay, I got to give each one equal attention. I got to be just as charming and accommodative to each one, right? But you have this glaring 10, and then you got this 2, and then this fucking 0. And so I'm just, the stress is immense. And it took all of my social skills to sort of remain a gentleman and be sort of equally attentive to. Have you ever been in a situation like this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm the same way. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I'm equally attentive, but I'm not a jerk, all right? I show some attention to the zeros. I'm a hero for the way I treat zeros. Okay, keep going, Elliott. Oh my God, we've lost Elliott Blatt. I mean, the story was just getting good. What the hell? Elliott, baby, come back. You can blame it all on me. I was wrong. And I just can't live without you. Elliott, come back. I'm spending all my shows, all my time, like doing anything I can just to get you off my mind. Elliott, are you still there? What the heck? What the heck? But I mean, here I am. It's 5:46 p.m. All right, the polls close on the East Coast in 14 minutes, but I'm right back where I started, and trying to forget you, Elliott, is just a waste of time. Elliott, come back. Any kind of fool could see there was something in everything about you. Elliott, come back. You can blame it all on me because I was wrong and I just can't stream without you. Like all day long, I wear a mask of false bravado. I try to keep up a smile that hides a tear. But as the sun goes down and the end of the first hour comes up on my live stream, I get that empty feeling again, how I wish to God that you were here and that I could hear you. Elliott, come back. Your device is not connected. You can blame it all on me. Oh, I was wrong. And I just can't stream without you. Okay, man, I was curious. Okay, fixing audio. No, leave the hangout and come back. All right, you're not connected. Device not connected, Elliott. So leave and come back. Leave and come back. Wasn't the attractive woman supposed to have been committed to Mr. Blatt's acquaintance? Did that not give Mr. Blatt any pause? A stiff prick has no conscience. All right. I'm sure it says that in the Talmud somewhere. Okay, Elliott. Okay, keep going, bro. Don't leave me hanging.
So we have this dinner, and it sort of goes off. It's so hard to explain the dynamics, but it was both sort of enjoyable but extremely stressful, right? So in the course of this, the mother sort of took a shine to me, right?
Yeah.
But the mother is I think she's really heavily on SSRIs.
Okay.
And she has a really flat affect, you know?
Okay.
So, but she's just not at all emotionally demonstrative at all. And but she's sort of taken a shine to me in this way. And somehow we exchange text numbers, and then she starts texting me all the time. So
it's a scam. They're running a scam.
I don't know. Okay. It feels like it's so hard to explain. So I was reticent. I was reluctant to even call him because I didn't have my thoughts purely formulated.
Oh, so this is where we've left things. When's the last time you heard from the hottie?
Text wise?
Yeah.
Today.
Really? What did she text you about?
Okay. So she fancies herself a stock trader.
Oh, day trader.
Day trader, yeah. And she has this whole methodology, and she's explained it to me. And she's basically recruiting clients.
Oh. Right? Oh, so she thinks you have money.
Yeah. That's certainly part of it.
Okay.
And so that's definitely an angle which I believe is operating here.
Mm-hmm.
So she's both sort of affectionate but extremely standoffish at the same time,
Is she
right?
Russian?
Latvian.
Oh, okay. So she's an adventurous.
Yeah. And the thing is like when you're not in her presence, you can think rationally.
Yeah.
But when you're in her presence,
Yeah. Yeah.
all
Impossible.
rationality just
Yeah.
leaves the room. Right? It's sort of like, I thought I was like this sort of
Caesar.
Caesar, this cold, calculating, purely rational animal, who
Yeah.
could withstand this type of onslaught. But I've learned that I cannot. I'm not. I'm neither cold nor rational.
Yeah.
And it was sort of, I don't know. There's got to be like scams out there. This has to
Yeah.
be the plot of some novel out there somewhere.
Yeah. Why would she
And-
think you have a substantial amount of money?
Well, I think Joe
Built you up.
built me up.
How on
I think-
earth did she know Joe?
It is okay. I'm gonna try and
Yeah, lie
explain
about
It
some
won't seem
details.
rational.
Just get to
It's-
the spiritual truth.
I mean, it won't seem rational, but in my neighborhood, there's this one sort of quasi supermarket where everybody goes because there's cheap wine.
Oh God.
So and there's cheap groceries in general, but particularly it's known for. So people of all economic strata shop here because they can get superb deals on wine. But other people like Joe, who's just cheap, like to go there because they can get good deals on groceries. So,
Is it also a neighborhood where you can pick up women who are strung out on drugs and have sex with them relatively cheaply?
no, and it's a
No.
reasonable thing
Okay.
to ask, but you have to understand there's sort of a two-tier. You have to understand the real geography and the economic neighborhoods of San Francisco to understand. So everyone has this assumption that San Francisco is just strewn with needles and feces, right?
Yeah.
It's not exactly the case. That's very much the case of all of the tourist destinations, but the regular sort of residential neighborhoods are sort of similar to what I would imagine like a regular residential neighborhood in LA would be like. Who's to know how long this will last? But suffice to say, the neighborhood I'm in is. Let's put it this way: I live in the lowest. I live in the worst place in one of the best neighborhoods in San Francisco. You ever
Okay.
you remember that movie? What was it about? Like this guy that lived in Beverly Hills, but at the dregs of Beverly Hills.
Yeah, the slums of Beverly Hills.
The
Yeah.
slums of Beverly Hills. I'm effectively that in San Francisco. I live in the slums of Seacliff. Right? I'm in the worst part of Seacliff. So like Jack Dorsey lives in my neighborhood.
Okay.
Right? But I'm at the bottom of that totem. But nevertheless, it's still Seacliff,
But where would you go to meet women who are strung out on drugs and are not too expensive, like in San Francisco? God forbid.
Not too expensive? Where would you
Or
go?
even free. Because
Well-
I know of one guy who likes to recreationally have intercourse with junkies.
Well, basically anything east of Van Ness,
Okay.
which is basically a third of the city. I mean, the downtown is riddled with fentanyl, and among those, there's some actually women that you can look around. You can see women that were like formerly quite attractive, but any significant experience with fentanyl is going to take the bloom off that rose, shall we say.
And it might also reduce their proclivity to say no.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But my God, think about.
So, but this guy Joe used to
Oh.
frequent those,
I know.
and like I said, listen, I want none of those people in my apartment. like 0.
Yeah.
And so he brought one into my apartment once, and I gave him a really stern talking to that was not to be repeated. And he observed that until he brings in this woman, this 10, who happens to be my neighbor. So
How on earth are they together? Like at any level?
well, okay. Joe had let on that he has a certain amount of capital.
Oh my God.
Right? So she had latched onto him, thinking that he would be the bridge to her trading empire.
Yeah.
You know, I'm piecing it all together now.
Yeah.
But part of me doesn't want to believe this is true, but and then he would use me as the sort of semi wingman type of situation, because he would seem to view anybody with an apartment as being, you know, upper crust, as it were.
Yes.
So it's this really sordid triangle, Luke. Is what I'm trying to say. And and it's just been a real struggle for me to retain my objectivity, because I just find myself looking at my phone like, is she texting me? Is she texting me? Oh my God, is she texting me? What now? You know? And so I guess this is why I want to discuss this with you. Like, is this a situation you find yourself in where you're like, you know something is wrong, but you want to believe otherwise because it's so flattering?
Yeah. This is the type of situation that will get you killed, that will get you drained of any financial resources. This is the type of situation that will massively F up your life.
Yeah. And it's like a moth to the flame, though. I'm drawn to it.
Yeah.
It's like, everybody thinks they're strong.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks they're virtuous until they've been tempted.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the proof is in the pudding, Luke. Like, the rubber hits the road now, Luke. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I just put a picture of this woman on the screen.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, but don't worry, keep going.
Okay.
I anonymized the picture.
Oh, I see the picture. Oh, wait, was that on Fox News?
Yeah.
No, she's hotter than that, dude.
Really?
Oh, God. Dude. It's, like, unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Like, it just doesn't happen. This is like a comet. This is Halley's Comet. You know what I mean? This shit doesn't happen to people like me, Luke.
Right, they didn't do this to me. I'm coming back here.
So anyway, there's other dimensions to this story related to Joe, which I would like to bring in, but they're a little bit too...
too close to home.
They're just too sordid for me to talk about, and I don't...
This is a very classy show. We don't go for the sordid.
We
don't go for sordid.
And I don't want to demean the show any further, but I don't know if you've had any thoughts on what I have.
There's. I mean, you can learn a great deal about someone about who they associate with. So that you met her through Joe is a little bit of a warning sign.
Yeah, huge warning sign. But then, like, I'm like, how does Joe? I'm going to use the word bipolar, because Joe, most of the time, I can't stand. Right? I totally dislike him. I find him very unlikable. But then he has like 20% of the time, or is incredibly thoughtful, engaging, and charismatic.
Yeah.
So I like 20% of Joe, and then 80% of Joe I can't stand. And like, I don't completely close the door. I was thinking about this, like, how did I wind up in this morass, you know? And it's like, it seems like I'm willing to sacrifice 80% I can't stand for the 20% that I like. And it doesn't seem like it's not like I can just shut the door on the 80%. It's like I either accept everything or nothing, right? There's no way. I have no control of saying, listen, I only want this 20% of you, and I don't want this other 80%. You know what I mean?
Yeah, people are a package deal.
Package deal. And so that's where I am right now. Like, because, what was it? Lying is a consensual act you used to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, usually you kind of want to be lied to because reality is too painful. So you want people to tell you a story.
Yeah. Well, I want to believe that I can get the 20% and not have the 80%, and that I can somehow manage the 80%. And if the 80% I don't like isn't really as bad as I'm making it out to be. But when I know in my gut that it is as bad as I know it is.
Yeah.
And so I guess it all boils down to self-deception. Like,
well, no, I think there's something much more important than that. And that is both Joe and this woman are meeting your needs, right? Whatever you're doing, it's meeting your needs. If you're drinking excessively, right, that's a solution that you're employing to a problem. So they are meeting a need that you're not getting met through a healthy way. And if you don't get to meet your needs in a healthy way, you'll meet them through an unhealthy way. So you have a need for human connection that is not getting met. And so you are meeting that need for connection through unhealthy ways because you're not able to meet it through healthy ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that all rings true to me.
So these are gifts. These are gifts. Like they're opening you up, and they're cracking you open. They're taking you out of your lethargy or your well-honed defenses and revealing what's really going on inside. Because who we are in love is who we really are, and you're in love with this woman some of the time, and that's revealing who you really are. And so you have an image of yourself as a Caesar, and I have an image of myself as a collected gentleman. But when love comes along, it rips apart our defenses and shows us as the needy beings that we don't want to believe we are, but we really are. And most of the time we can fool ourselves that we're not this needy. And we've developed such developed defenses that we hide from ourselves the painful truth of how needy we are. And then occasionally someone will come along and put a mirror to our soul and show the intensity of our need and how it will lead us off path.
Yeah, that all sounds true. That all sounds true. And so, I don't know. It's something. I'm in this real life chess game now. You know, and there's other dimensions that I wish I could bring up in the stream that I just think aren't appropriate. But there's
right. But you're thinking about managing this, and what's going on is that you have, this huge whirlpool inside that cannot be managed. You can be distracted from its existence most of the time, and imagine that you've got it managed, but it's leaking out all the time. You're just not seeing it. So this is just ripping off the mask and showing you something that's there congenitally, continually, daily. It's just that you're normally able to avoid seeing it, but now you can't avoid seeing it. But it's there all the time. You're just not seeing it.
Yeah, no, that's true. And so, I don't have any clear thoughts. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
it's
good.
Great
anyway,
story.
so this is a drama. There's other things I'd like to talk to you privately about sometimes because
great.
It's ultra complicated. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay, this is a safe space.
Okay, thanks, bro. Appreciate it.
Thanks, bro. Okay, blessings.
All right, blessings. All right, talk soon.
Okay. All right. Let's take this show in a different direction. All right, there's a new book out, came out last year, Making Endless War. So Elliott wants to make endless love. We got a new book out, Making Endless War, the Vietnam and Arab-Israeli conflicts in the history of international law. And our favorite senior lecturer in law at Australian Catholic University is Amanda Alexander. And she has a valuable essay here that you should show to your entire family. So this is Amanda Alexander, senior lecturer in law at Australian Catholic University. All right, her essay is called Revolutionary War and the Development of International Humanitarian Law. Right, so begins by talking about the distinction between civilians and combatants. So civilian is a term that developed in the 19th century, but it didn't really rise to prominence until after World War II. So currently, the protection of civilians is the central precept of human rights, international humanitarian law, the rules of law, and there are just a handful of dominant institutions in these fields. One of them is the International Committee of the Red Cross. The other one is Amnesty International, and the other one is Human Rights Watch. So the International Committee of the Red Cross lists of customary rules of international humanitarian law, right? The principle of distinction between combatants and civilians. All right, do you think that's Rule 1, Rule 21, Rule 101? It is Rule 1. Rule 4, combatants are members of armed forces. Rule 5, civilians are those who are not members of armed forces. So 200 years ago, there was no concept of civilian, right? Members of your enemy's state or tribe were still your enemies, right? That is the traditional approach to this problem, right? So if you're an Israeli and you've got Hamas terrorists who kill 1,200 of your own people, right? You don't just think of Hamas as your enemy, right? You think of the Palestinians as your enemy, right? Men, women, children, they're all your enemies. That's the normal, natural human reaction. Like, who's my in-group? Who is the enemy of my in-group? And then all of them are my enemies, right? That's the normal instinct. So if you have a lot of bad experiences with Jews, with gays, with blacks, with Puerto Ricans, right, you're very likely to develop a negative attitude towards those groups, and you're not going to distinguish between civilians and just those members of the group that you don't like. So Rule 106, I think we all know the International Committee of the Red Cross list of customary rules of international humanitarian law, but just to remind you, Rule 106 is combatants must identify themselves before attacking to be eligible for prisoner of war status. So if you were a Jewish American, a Jewish Australian, a Jewish Englishman, a Jewish Canadian who was captured by the Nazis, you were treated just the same as if you were a non-Jewish combatant fighting for the Nazis, and you were accorded, pretty decent treatment. 99% of Allies taken prisoner in, normal health survived World War II. So 2 German prisoners who were captured by the Allies during World War II, over 99% of them survived. They were treated decently because all sides to this conflict between the Western Allies and Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Hitler had signed on to the Geneva Conventions. However, the Soviet Union did not sign on to the Geneva Convention, so only about 10%, 20% of the prisoners taken by Nazi Germany from the Soviets, or of Germans taken by the Soviets, only 10, 20% managed to survive the war, as opposed to 99% for the Allies, because the Soviets did not sign on to the Geneva Conventions. Ergo, their prisoners were not accorded the type of treatment demanded by the Geneva Conventions. So the International Committee of the Red Cross list of customary rules of international humanitarian law, it reflects the provisions of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. Right? And these provisions are now considered customary and essentially universal. But when they were negotiated during the, who can forget these exciting days, the halcyon days of 1974-77 diplomatic conferences on the reaffirmation and development of international humanitarian law applicable in armed conflict, many of these sections were highly contested. So when you get the news, you don't hear about all sorts of categories being contested and contingent. Instead, it's just, oh, human rights law says, international humanitarian law says X, Y, Z, the president says this, and the proclamations of players are treated as though people mean what they say and say what they mean, when in reality, almost nobody means what they say, and almost nobody means what they say, nobody says what they mean. So the ambiguous definition of combatants and civilians contained within the protocol continues to be a cause for ongoing scholarly and legal consideration. So how did the Vietnam and Arab-Israeli wars play out here? And how did they contribute to the awkward shape of these provisions of international humanitarian law? Right, Vietnam, right, the Vietnam War served as the archetype of the contemporary conflicts that prompted the International Committee of the Red Cross to draft these new laws. So when the International Committee of the Red Cross began calling for new laws of armed conflict, it was concerned with military developments such as aviation that had almost wiped out the fundamental distinctions between combatants and civilians. So prior to World War II, during the 1920s and 1930s, the fundamental differences between civilians and combatants had essentially been removed. But now, all right, you've got a tidal wave of guerrilla activity that had not been anticipated by earlier Geneva conventions. And so the Vietnam War was the consummate example of these concerns. Right? And the Vietnam War informed the drafting by challenging traditional Western understanding of the laws of armed conflict. So the revolutionary writings on People's War, put into practice in Vietnam, created new language and a new paradigm for just war, and advocated the legitimacy of the very type of guerrilla warfare that the Palestinians have been waging against the Jewish state for 5 decades now. Glib Medley says, I remember the media buzz when Jimmy Carter said foreign policy would be guided by human rights concerns. Yes. So the language of the Vietnam War, the language of the Vietnamese communists was adopted by the Palestinian movements. And so they presented their struggle as analogous to the Vietnamese People's War. So support for the Palestinians and the Palestinian Liberation Organization led to a whole series of United Nations resolutions proclaiming the rights of national liberation movements and their fighters in legal language that would later be repeated at diplomatic conferences. And at the same time, right, there's growing support for the Palestinian and Vietnamese resistance in the West. So wars against imperial powers are increasingly accepted as just and righteous, and the means used to oppose imperial powers, right, are also regarded as just and righteous. And popular and academic and elite commentary in the West would question the lawfulness of counterinsurgency techniques that were used to combat the communist guerrillas and the Palestinians, in particular, the attacks on civilians. And these conversations, these debates are reflected in the arguments of the Diplomatic Conference of 1974 to 77, and ultimately in the provisions of the Additional Protocol 1, which provides all sorts of new protections for terrorists and guerrilla fighters. So you're probably wondering, what the heck? I wonder what Nathan Kofnes has to say about these lofty matters.
It's a very disappointing conclusion because it's really unclear what the solution could possibly be. To the extent that wokeism is simply an expression of preferences that are disproportionately female.
I would add disproportionately female, or that arise in circumstances where females are well represented even among men.
Yeah, so it emanates from and then is reinforced by female presence, and we're not turning the clock back on that. Like, that's a non-starter. So we have to find some way of addressing these issues, acknowledging that men and women are both going to be part of these institutions. So we have to find some way to come to an agreement between men and women and find some kind of desirable arrangement. But there is this very strong tendency. Maybe it's not. Maybe it might not be all women or necessarily most women, but it is enough of a tendency among women that there's a very strong push in the direction of using certain methods to address to regulate behavior that are not really consistent with the classical liberal understanding of free speech and so on. Now, on my view, this is certainly, I'm not saying the equality thesis and the response to the equality thesis is the only important thing that's happened in the last 50 years, right? So there are lots of other things that are happening, lots of other trends that are interacting with what I say is the core of wokeism. But the feminization of the institutions is certainly an important phenomenon that's going on, which influences the way that wokeism is expressed. That would be my view. But on your view, I think you might place more importance on feminization of institutions as a cause of wokeism per se.
Well, possibly. I mean, I did try to emphasize in my article that I didn't actually disagree with anything you said in that regard. It was just a slightly different degree of emphasis on different factors. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, I basically agree that the acceptance of racial hereditarianism, racial environmentalism by elites is causally related to the rise of wokeness. But in the case of feminization, I do think it's very important and largely exogenous, or at least partly exogenous. In other words, it's an independent factor that also contributed to the emergence of this phenomenon, and that perhaps might have been sufficient by itself to cause.
So I think the growth of human rights and international humanitarian law is in large part a reflection of females becoming increasingly dominant in these fields.
Was both the elites to abandon hereditarianism and cause wokeness, because I think not only do women hold views, or at least sort of proto-woke views, more strongly than men, but they also seem to cause men to adopt those views in their presence. Perhaps, due to a desire on the part of men not to be in conflict with women, or to increase their chances of succeeding with them romantically. It's not entirely clear. But one could engage in a certain amount of wishful thinking and suggest that a lot of the shift in academia is due disproportionately to women in the disciplines that could be described as fake, or at least much less rigorous than the traditional.
Yeah, speaking of fake disciplines, we got international humanitarian law and human rights. Right, back to Amanda Alexander. So to appreciate the changes wrought by the Additional Protocol 1, it's necessary to understand the legal position before the conferences of the 1970s. Right, so the International Committee of the Red Cross and various human rights activists and other commentators will claim there were long-standing principles protecting civilians and a regrettable lack of law concerning guerrilla warfare. This was a misrepresentation of the existing state of the laws of armed conflict. So guerrilla wars and people's wars, or irregular wars, right, were very much familiar terms in both military and legal circles from the 19th century. Right, the term guerrilla dates back to the Spanish irregular forces in the Napoleonic Wars. Right, guerrilla tactics have been used by both regular and irregular forces for thousands of years. Right, the German experience in the Franco-Prussian War, the British experience in the Anglo-Boer War, were perhaps the most pivotal in shaping the understanding of irregular war in the late 19th century, and these informed the attitudes of the military states of the Hague conferences in 1899 and 1907. So people at these conferences, the delegates, agreed there was a strong likelihood that citizens would take up arms. And so for some delegates, particularly those representing Switzerland and Belgium, this was an admirable display of patriotism. Right? The response of a British general, however, was to suggest adding an article that stated the convention should not be read as diminishing or suppressing the right that belongs to the population of an invaded country to fulfill its duty of opposing the invaders by every legitimate means. Germany and the Netherlands, however, opposed this approach. Germany acknowledged the value of patriotism, but stated that nothing prevented patriots from entering the army, from organizing themselves properly with a leader and with distinctive signs. And Germany points out an obvious point. Soldiers, too, need to be considered. Soldiers are men. They have a right to be treated humanely. Soldiers exhausted by fatigue after a long march or a battle, and they come to rest in a village, they have a right to be sure that the peaceful inhabitants of the village shall not suddenly change into furious enemies. So how do you resolve this? Right, 26% of the vote counted. So we got George Latimer with a big lead over Jamal Bowman. Just because you write a war that women like, that doesn't mean you're selling out. Thank you, Glib Medley. That's correct. Right, so Theodore Martens presided over the Second Commission at the First Hague peace conference, and he declared that while it was desirable that the uses of war should be defined and regulated, it would not be possible to agree on all cases. Therefore, in cases not agreed upon, populations and belligerents should remain under the protection and the empire principles of international law. They result from the use established between civilized nations, from the laws of humanity, and the requirements of public conscience. So this leaves the door open to patriotic acts, since a heroic nation is, like heroes, above codes, above rules, and above facts. Right? So this allayed some Belgian fears about the treatment of guerrillas. However, in practice, it meant that Germany and the other great powers had their way in this debate. So Martin's statement suggests that any irregular fighting, such as terrorism and guerrilla fighting, will take place outside the law and in the face and in opposition to the law. Right, so this is the 1907 Hague Convention, requires that legitimate belligerents who want to avail themselves with the protection of Hague Conventions must distinguish themselves at all times, must carry arms openly, must follow irresponsible command, must conduct their operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war. It's obviously not how the Palestinians have fought. Article 2 of the regulation states that members of a guerrilla force would be regarded as belligerents. They rose up before being occupied, carried arms openly, and respected the laws and customs of war. Right? They would then be accorded the rights of being a prisoner of war. Right? However, there was no right to resistance once you were occupied. So occupied inhabitants could not be allowed to attack the occupiers' lines of communication, because without lines of communication, right, an army cannot exist. So any provisions that protected citizens would depend on the citizens being peaceful. As soon as citizens cease to be peaceful, as soon as the Palestinians, for example, cease to be peaceful, then it's open season, right? Because if the citizens do not remain peaceful, right, the guarantees will lose their whole reason for existence. 1949 Geneva Conventions come along, and they do little to change these requirements. Right? If you're a part of an organized resistance movement, you have to distinguish yourself. Right? You have to have a distinctive sign. So guerrilla warfare, regular warfare had been comprehensively considered and regulated well before the 1970s, and the law was clear. If you're a combatant, you had to distinguish yourself if you wanted to avail yourself of the protections of being a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. Citizens who became involved in the war outside these strictures were liable to be executed, and the rest of the population was liable to reprisals. So you don't have much protection for civilians. Right? The only clear provision is found in Article 25 of the 1949 Hague Convention. It prohibits the bombardment of undefended towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings. But if these places are filled with enemy fighters, such as the situation in Gaza, right, you can bomb away. Right, so attacking forces had to warn the besieged city of an impending bombardment if possible, which is how Israel is conducting this war. Article 27 encourages attackers to avoid damaging buildings dedicated to religion, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected. Aside from these provisions, right, civilians are exposed to the exigencies of war. There's no requirement to allow civilians, non-combatants, useless mouths to leave a besieged town. Civilians can be killed by starvation, by bombardment. Whole regions can be devastated if that is necessary for military success. Once aerial war becomes a possibility, it was understood it was likely to be used to kill civilians. Attempts to limit the use of aerial war on civilians failed in the 1920s, 1930s, certainly in the 1940s, and again in the 1950s. So it was generally accepted that citizens of an enemy state are enemies too. Right? That is the traditional way of regarding the non-combatants among your enemy, right? That citizens of an enemy state are enemies too. If it's possible to bring a war to a speedier conclusion by harming them, then it should be done so as a necessity of war. So under these provisions, Israel's conduct in Gaza would be considered A-OK.
Traditional disciplines, i.e., the studies departments and so on. And if you got rid of the disciplines that aren't really doing very much that's rigorous, you might see a disproportionate change in the other disciplines, in that the most activist-prone people of both genders, particularly women, would be gone. But of course, that's unlikely to happen now because they've gained such a foothold and have sort of proliferated out into the administration and bureaucracy as well, that it's difficult to see how one would do that.
Well, we can't get rid of. We have to. it seems that there is a kind of male versus female morality. So in male-only institutions and female-only institutions, then they can be expressed without any conflict, coming into conflict with the other one. Now, both of these moralities have different strengths and weaknesses. So the turning society into a kind of boot camp might be taking like
An extreme male
a
perspective.
negative expression of male morality, and on the female side, like just a complete disregard for truth and over feelings. And
I think we have to quote Amy Wax here, who said that women have brought the values of the kindergarten into the academy.
God forbid, women have brought the values of the kindergarten into the academy. Mike says in the chat, so bizarre, people don't know you have to be uniform for the rules of war to apply. Well, that's not true any longer. Right? That's the main difference between soldiers and terrorists. Well, terrorists in Gaza are claiming all the protections of uniformed soldiers. Why? How do they do this? So 1949 Geneva Convention 4 is drafted to provide protection for civilians, but it does little to protect civilians during war. Right? It does not include any new constraints on aerial war, reprisals against civilians, scorched earth tactics, or the starvation of civilians. Rather, it focuses on the protection of civilians in occupied territories. Its main goal is to prohibit another Jewish Holocaust. Right? So any protections from the 1949 Geneva Convention for civilians completely depends upon civilians remaining passive. Right? Once they engage in hostile activities, they lose the rights of protected persons. And even the protection offered to passive civilians is contingent on military imperatives. And Article 27 acknowledges that the parties to the conflict may take such measures of control and security with regard to protected persons as may be necessary as a result of war. So it prohibits mass forcible transfers, but it accepts that an occupying power may undertake total evacuation of a given area if the security of the population or imperative military reasons so demand. And the 1949 Geneva Convention envisages that governments may manage their own populations in the same manner. Right? It provides for parties to set up separate neutralized zones to shelter non-combatants. Right? So civilians who take part in hostilities will naturally be excluded. So protection offered to civilians by the 1949 Geneva Convention depends upon a clear distinction between civilians and combatants, both in legal and in spatial terms. So this reflects a common military strategy that was then used before and after the drafting of these provisions. You'd separate the civilian populations from the combatants that they might support, whether you separate them willingly or you separate them under their duress. Right? And that's the way people had waged war. I think about the destruction of Boer farms, relocation of their inhabitants into concentration camps. One of the most familiar examples. There were similar movements of civilians during the Spanish-American War in Cuba and in the Philippines during the American intervention. Similar approaches were taken by the Japanese in Manchuria, by Portugal in Angola, and by Britain in Malaya and Kenya. So the aim is to separate guerrillas from any support from the population. South Vietnam, President Diem started moving rural communities to constructed communities from 1959 to separate the peasants from the revolutionaries. Right? This was turned under the Americans into the Strategic Hamlet Program. Right? You got thousands of fortified hamlets. The aim is to concentrate and shelter the population in hamlets, relocating villages when necessary to produce villagers who actively supported the South Vietnamese government and cutting off support for the communist guerrillas from North Vietnam. Now, various scholars will talk about this moving and resettling of populations in camps as a technique of liberal empire. Right? It's a biopolitical attempt to govern, to domesticate, and to deny political agency to colonial populations. All right, so the whole intent of these laws is to limit political and military agency through both a legal and a spatial separation of civilians and combatants. So despite all these experiences with irregular warfare, the prevailing idea of war, the main theories, the war games, and the laws of war were all shaped by an ideal of orderly soldiers in uniform, of subdued citizens separated and demilitarized. However, over the course of the 20th century, an alternative imagination of war and an approach to human rights law and laws of war was formed, right? An approach that was exemplified by the war in Vietnam and that was embraced by the Palestinian movements. So this alternative model is the communist model, a revolutionary people's war, a war where there's no separation between people and army, a war that unapologetically employs guerrilla tactics, right? This is what the Palestinians use, right? They follow the same tactics that the North Vietnamese used, right? So guerrilla warfare is an old technique, but now it becomes associated with revolutionary communist ideology. And one of the main sources for this new approach were the writings of Chairman Mao, and his success in China inspired revolutionaries of a communist variety all around the world. So Mao in China provides a model for revolutionary people's war that becomes referenced by a whole bunch of revolutionary movements that all seek to overturn imperial or oppressive or right-wing governments. So you got principles from the Maoist model that are followed by revolutionaries in Malaya, Burma, Algeria, Rhodesia, and Cuba. But the clearest association perhaps was with the communist movement in Vietnam. And the success of the whole Vietnamese strategy further inspired other movements, including the Palestinians. Right after the 1967 war shattered Palestinian hopes for liberation through traditional war, Palestinian movements explicitly characterized their struggle as a revolutionary people's war in the manner of Vietnam. The Communist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, followed Mao's teachings closely. Fatah, right, took a less rigorous, more eclectic, more secular approach to revolutionary theory, but still echoed the general themes of the Maoist approach. All right, there were significant differences between the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Palestinians and their conditions. Right, it is hard for people to reconcile Palestinian tactics with prevailing understandings of guerrilla war. But by presenting the Palestinian struggle as a second Vietnam, right, they managed to situate themselves within the global revolutionary movement that was reshaping the vision of justifiable warfare. So in time, the Palestinian arguments would strengthen and develop and become more embraced by more countries and more people all around the world. So Mao developed his model for revolutionary war in the 1930s. He took Marxist-Leninist theory and adopted it to Chinese conditions, and he would emphasize the role of the peasants in a prolonged people's war. So Mao's strategy had three phases. Right? One, you mobilize the peasants. Two, you gain their support by employing guerrilla strategies. And finally, you move towards conventional war. So Mao stressed the first phase, the mobilization of the people, is absolutely essential for victory. And that's what Hamas has done for the Palestinians in Gaza. Right? You can attribute Mao's victories to his widespread support from the people. And you have descriptions of the war in Vietnam that go along a similar line. The war of liberation of the Vietnamese people proves that in the face of an enemy as powerful as he is cruel, victory is possible only by uniting the whole people within the bosom of a firm and wide national united front based on the worker-peasant alliance. So Mao would introduce rules and disciplines to avoid alienating the people, maintain a good, even symbiotic relationship between the people and the troops. So Chairman Mao says only undisciplined troops who make the people their enemies and who, like the fish out of its native element, cannot live. So Mao's troops would observe the three main rules of discipline and the 8 points for attention. They'd carry out campaigns to support the government, cherish the people, do good deeds for the people. They made use of every possibility to engage in activity that would help the people, help them overcome economic difficulties, better their own livelihoods, lighten the people's burdens. And by their exemplary conduct, they would win the wholehearted support of the masses, who would affectionately call them our boys. And the Palestinian movement employed similar strategies. They emphasized the support of the population. This will be our greatest advantage. The masses would be a revolutionary power capable of liquidating direct colonialism and occupation. So because of this overriding need to gain the support of the population, right, for communists, they would overlook class differences and even engage with the petite bourgeois class of the people. But the role of the people then would go beyond mere support. Right? There was no longer a necessary separation between civilians and combatants. Right? It's possible and appropriate to be both. Those who say, I am a farmer or I am a student, I can discuss literature but not military arts. This is incorrect. There is no profound difference between the farmer and the soldier. You must have courage. You simply leave your farms and become soldiers. You are farmers is of no difference. And if you have education, that is so much the better. When you take your arms in hand, you become soldiers. When you're organized, you become military units. So when the enemy comes, we fight. When the enemy goes, we plow. Right, so this is a complete disavowal of the controlled and passive population imagined by the Geneva Conventions, where the civilian population is limited to peaceful pursuits. So from a revolutionary perspective, this oppressed class only deserve to be treated as slaves if they do not learn to use arms in their own defense. And for Palestinian movements, the transformation of Palestinians from refugees to revolutionaries is regarded as a therapeutic measure toward healing Palestinian society. It's a cultural renaissance. That armed struggle becomes the source of political legitimacy and national identity. Right? It's the new substance of the imagined community of the Palestinians. So a people's war is necessarily a terrorist war and a guerrilla war, at least in the initial phases. So revolutionary doctrine describes guerrilla tactics as the obvious weapon of the weak against a more powerful opponent. And you hear this rhetoric about why do Palestinians engage in terrorism? Because they're weak going up against the most powerful military in the Middle East. Guerrilla war allows for the mobilization of the whole strength of the people against the enemy. People's army can wear out its opponent till it is possible eventually to transition to conventional warfare. So guerrilla warfare is the only way to mobilize and apply the whole strength of the people against the enemy, the only way to expand our forces in the course of the war and deplete and weaken the enemy and gradually change the balance of forces between the enemy and ourselves, switching from guerrilla to mobile warfare, and finally defeat the enemy. Back to Nathan Kofnas, Noah Carl.
So in principle, some kind of, in all major philosophical traditions, right, there's a concept of yin and yang, right, and that they interact with each other, and there's some kind, they should be in balance, both within the individual and within society as a whole, right? It seems, now there's maybe more of a conflict between female morality and the goals of academia, which is theoretically, right, just get at the truth, find the truth, debunk everyone who's wrong, right?
Engage with your opponent's arguments rather than assuming they have, nasty motives.
So this disproportionately attracts like people who are kind of on the spectrum, autism spectrum, which just means like male-brained people, right? Because autism, according to an influential view, is just extreme male-brainedness.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are plenty of great like women scholars who've made who certainly ought to be in academia.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of overlapping bell curves.
Right. And also, I think women have some strengths in certain fields, and that have and that they've been able to make contributions in certain areas, right? And there should obviously, it's good to have space for that. So that's not something to be upset about. But we haven't found a way to push back against the excesses of female morality.
No, Louise Perry had an interesting article recently in which she teased this out in a way that I thought was quite compelling. She pointed out that it's single mothers who are, single women who are childless, who are the most woke, just in terms of the statistics, I think is what she said. And this can be understood from the perspective of their maternal nurturing instincts not having a suitable biological target, namely their children, and therefore being directed towards disadvantaged groups in society. And that therefore one might consider the decline in fertility to be another sort of independent cause of wokeness. That doesn't really answer your question. I just thought it was an interesting point. I mean, as I said before, if there was some way of making academia rigorous again and selecting each individual based on merit, obviously not excluding women because they're women, I think you might be able to reduce a problem significantly, because I think it's people who are selected from extreme ends of various psychological traits who populate these activist disciplines that are doing disproportionate harm and sort of have caused people who otherwise might hold slightly more moderate views to be cowed into silence or to virtue signal in ways we would regard as deleterious. But other than that, yeah, it's a very difficult question as to know what to do. I'm not sure I have any answers for you.
One of the reasons I was skeptical of this theory before I read your article is because so many of the people who were attacking me were men.
Okay, let's get more here from Amanda Alexander. So there's no problem in revolutionary communist literature that guerrilla war is a problem either ethically or legally. It's sensible, it's strategic. Chairman Mao declared, "We should honestly admit the guerrilla character of the Red Army. We shouldn't be ashamed of this. This guerrilla character is precisely our distinguishing feature. It's our strong point. It is our means of defeating the enemy. Guerrilla war is more than a pragmatic strategy. Guerrilla war is heroic, it's romantic, has an established history. It is superhuman heroism and bravery and self-sacrifice, right? And this resonates both among subjugated peoples and in the West. So guerrilla fighters are justified because they're engaged in just wars, fighting against imperialism and unjust aggression. So you hear a lot about the term imperialism. So what the hell does imperialism really mean? It's the policy of extending your power. You can do it economically, culturally. So it's a fancy word for condemning something that is just inherent to the human condition, that the more fit, right, the more adept, right, are going to have more power, right? And so if you're more fit, different groups have different gifts. And so some groups will naturally have more power than other groups. And if this fact of life upsets you, you call it nasty names. You call it racism, imperialism, colonialism. But as long as different people have different gifts, as long as the combination of different people with different gifts in different environments, right, you're going to have disparate outcomes. And so you're going to have some groups that are more militarily or culturally or religiously or artistically powerful than other groups, and hence they will have an imperial influence. That's why I want to do an essay on false and real categories for morality. So this idea that simply because different people have different gifts, right, that this is somehow the greatest evil is absurd, right? It's just a basic part of morality, of reality. And I think that morality should be based upon accepting reality, not denying reality. So from the communist guerrilla Palestinian perspective, right, imperialists like Israel, right, bullying and enslaving peoples, plundering their wealth, encroaching upon others' sovereignty and interfering in their internal affairs. Well, if you're more powerful than your neighbor, your power can't help but have some interference in their affairs. Just like if you're a total loser, right, and your wife is constantly meeting men who are winners, like how long do you think she's going to be happy stuck with you, a loser, when there may be men who are winners who are pursuing her? Well, that's imperialism. She's using her beauty and her brains and her wonders to tantalize and create influence over others, right? She's an imperialist, right? We're all imperialists. We're all eugenicists, all right? We all take care with who we reproduce. So as soon as you make any consideration about those people that you might consider having children with, all right, you are practicing eugenics. If you exercise influence over others, you are an imperialist. And if you recognize that different people have different gifts, you are a racist and a bigot and a hater. So the imperialist from a communist perspective, right? It's the communist perspective that hates the facts of life, such as different people have different gifts. But from a communist perspective, the winner, right, the successful countries that influence other countries are rabid aggressors. They are the most ferocious common enemy of the people of the world. So George Gilder wrote a book called The Israel Test, and essentially the test boils down to, do you resent those who excel you? If you don't resent those who excel you, you won't resent Israel. If you do resent people who excel you and groups and nations who excel you, then you're much more likely to hate Israel. So from a commie perspective, every people in the world that wants revolution, independence, and peace must struggle against U.S. imperialism and Israeli imperialism. And guerrilla fighters are trying to safeguard the freedom and independence of their people. And Palestinian movements characterize their cause as part of this global fight against imperialism, analogous to the Vietnamese struggle, and they still characterize their cause this way. I've been watching a lot of pro-Palestine videos, and they almost all use this language. They're fighting against imperialism, fighting against colonialism. They're fighting against settlers. They regard the inhabitants of the Jewish state of Israel as settlers. So I think at a certain point, like 1880, 90% of the inhabitants of what's now the current land of Israel were Arabs. The Palestinian movements, right, they take on the Vietnamese narrative, and they argue that Israel which used to be regarded as a beset, heroic nation, right? It's an imperialist base nation carrying out a program of colonization and dispossession. So people never emerge out of the earth, right? So whenever a people set up an organization and protect a certain territory, right, they've usually had to displace other persons, or certainly to protect their territory from the incursions of others. So the communists and the Palestinians would say, look, the whole crux of the Palestinian problem is the piecemeal conquest and continued seizure of the entire country by military force. Well, the country was seized by a more intelligent and more effective group, and the less intelligent and less effective were evicted from the land. More effective people tend to seize more of life because the strong take what they want and the weak endure what they must. So it's this forcible dispossession and displacement of the bulk of the indigenous population and subjugation of the rest. And this is just awful. Right? This is the most evil thing from the communist, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist perspective, as this colonization by the foreign settlers from Europe of both the expropriated private land and the seized national resources of the overpowered people. So another term for overpowered people is less effective people, people who are unable to seize and protect their territory. So what happens in nature when you've got two subspecies in the same place? Right? Inevitably, one subspecies, right, drives out the other subspecies. Right? When you have different forms of life fighting for survival, right, some win and some don't. And it's the same with people. So it's this ideology of imperialism and racism and bigotry as the colonialism as the greatest of evils, right, and the legitimacy of terrorists and guerrilla tactics to overcome imperialism achieves growing recognition and repetition in the United Nations General Assembly because you've got increasing numbers of decolonized nations. So you get a whole series of General Assembly resolutions stating that Zionism is racism and that racism is bad, that all people have the right to self-determination, except when that's inconvenient for these people, especially those fighting alien domination. Right? And this term, alien domination, was created to cover the Palestinian situation. Now, in 1970, UN Resolution 2649 specifically condemns the denial of that right to the people of Palestine, right? That right to fight for self-determination. Now, this resolution would not support the right of Jews in this space to fight for self-determination. Resolution 3103 in 1973 reaffirms that colonialism is a crime. Colonial peoples have the right to struggle against colonial powers and alien domination using all necessary means at their disposal. And such conflicts are to be viewed as international armed conflicts, and combatants are to be accorded the status of prisoners of war. So terrorists and guerrillas and people who don't wear any insignia must be accorded the status of prisoners of war. So you have this whole new understanding of imperialism, meaning countries that are particularly effective as against countries that are ineffective, right? It's now a crime to be effective. And that justifies the use of all necessary means of opposition, not only defending guerrilla warfare, but in all the debates about terrorism in the United Nations, terrorism is actually a good thing because you're fighting against imperialism. Right? UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim from Austria tried to introduce an item entitled Measures to Prevent International Terrorism in the General Assembly following the events at the Munich Olympics when the Palestinian terrorists killed all of the Olympic team from Israel. But this item was changed to include a study of the underlying causes of those forms of terrorism and acts of violence, which lie in misery, frustration, grievance, and despair, which cause some people to sacrifice lives, including their own, in an attempt to effect radical change. So the discussion that ensues, right, pits the alternatives as state terrorism or individual terrorism. So we've got a growing divide between the proponents of terrorism, national liberation, and the enemies of international terrorism. And so the UN sets up the Ad Hoc Committee for International Terrorism, which reaffirms the legitimacy of terrorism, legitimacy of the struggle for self-determination and national liberation. Right, this is the intellectual bedrock and the foundation for widespread international support for the Palestinians. The recognition of the Palestinian cause in the UN General Assembly culminates in 1974. It invites Yasser Arafat, a terrorist, to address the General Assembly and passes resolutions 3236 and 3237, which reiterate that the Palestinians have the right to self-determination. The Jews in Israel don't have that right, and grant the Palestine Liberation Organization, right, this terrorist organization, observer status at the UN. So these resolutions give more and more foundation for national liberation and terrorism. They give these forms of terrorism and guerrilla warfare more legitimacy and more legality. Now, traditional commentators insist the General Assembly statements were politics, not law. But there's no clear divide between politics and law. There's no clear divide always between narrative and law, right? Law always occurs within a context of narratives and of politics. Right, so these traditional commentators said, oh, this is the danger that democracy in the General Assembly, it can derail the lofty traditions of international law. Well, it's completely rewritten the traditions of international law. So those who assert the view of decolonized states that national liberation movements are a form of self-defense and that insurgent leaders should be so recognized, but this is a political challenge to an existing law. So the alternative view of war has garnered great political legitimacy, but its legal status is controversial. So the theory of the People's War provides a stark alternative to traditional laws of war. Right, so fundamental aspects of traditional laws of war, such as the status of national liberation wars, appear a problem and ethically suspect to Western experts. So these conflicts shape a subtle shift in the interpretation of the laws of armed conflict in the West. And the bulk of the discussion around Israel focuses on the justice of Israeli and Palestinian claims to nationhood, territory, and belligerency. But there is growing disapproval of Israel's counterinsurgency, counterterrorism tactics. In particular, reprisals against individuals or states for supporting guerrilla or terrorist actions. We got Western international lawyers and states beginning to question the legality of these operations. Right, so this is the foundation for the modern, widespread elite opposition to Israel's war in Gaza, especially when they're directed at civilian objects and when these responses appear disproportionate. Right, this is the whole foundation for the modern elite war on Israel's war in Gaza.
I think at the time, like the most high-profile woke critic of me was Mark Alfano, who was on this jihad to get my paper retracted, and his allies were like Jason Stanley and some other people like that. And there were some women too, but I felt like at the time, in my experience, the most aggressive people seemed to be men. But yeah, I mean, as you say, like cancel culture, I don't think is like a women's thing necessarily. Like men were also interested in burning witches and fighting heretics. Although certainly women played a big role in those things.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest this is, if only we got rid of the women, everything would be fine. And the women are the only people causing problems. Clearly, a lot of men are causing problems too.
But statistically, yeah, if you look at the data, there's no way to deny it. Like there's support for free speech.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw this tweet I made a few weeks ago. It was based on a recent paper by a Finnish scholar where he obtained survey data on academics and students in different disciplines in Finland, I think. And he basically gave them a series of questions that ask about woke beliefs, things like are racial disparities due to racism and other related attitudes. And he found indeed that there were sizable disparities, with women in academia being substantially more likely to endorse these attitudes than men in each of the disciplines he looked at.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I think we need a better understanding of how mixed sex group dynamics play out, because I mean, I've noticed just anecdotally that men seem less willing to express their true opinions about controversial topics, particularly where women are concerned, in the presence of women. But that's not empirical evidence. That's just my experience.
Well, empirical evidence.
Yeah, that rings true to me. Men are less willing to express their opinion on controversial topics when there are women present. Absolutely.
Starts with observation, right? So,
I mean, reactionaries on Twitter will say, this is why most societies through history have been patriarchal. You really can't have a lasting civilization unless women play a subordinate role in major institutions. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they'll say.
Well, if elites came to accept hereditarianism with respect to race, and that would presumably come with hereditarianism with respect to sex differences, and most people are vaguely, I think even in the elites, You have to be pretty woke to deny that there are sex differences.
Yeah, I would even go as far as to saying that
And the question
most
in the
elites
chat,
accept that there are, or at least a
look, are you using AI to put out your short videos? Yeah, AI starts the process, but there's a lot of work still that I have to do. So I have to choose which section, so I may extend or diminish the AI suggestions. I will remove unnecessary words. I'll clean out pauses and nonsense. So AI begins the process, right? Opus Clips is the program I use to make short videos, but there's a tremendous amount of work that I have to do. Okay, back to this terrific essay by Amanda Alexander. So the anti-Vietnam War movement launches a comprehensive attack on the way the United States is fighting the Vietnam War. Right? This attack says that the way U.S. is fighting, right, counterinsurgency tactics that then get translated to Afghanistan and Iraq, right, most famously under David Petraeus, right, the growing elite opinion is that these counterinsurgency, counter-terrorism tactics are immoral and illegal. Popular protests and media reports draw attention to the violence and depravity of the war, the attacks on civilians and children. Intellectuals and journalists produce inquiries into the acts. They stage trials judging the U.S. campaign. And so you get a substantial change in legal discourse by the start of the 1974 to 77 diplomatic conferences. Right? So critics of the Vietnam War would essentially echo the critiques of the communists. The Vietnamese National Resistance Forces were on the side of right, according to growing numbers of elite lefties and dominant institutions in the West. Right? The Viet Cong are on the side of the right. They're on the side of the law. They're defending the principles of international law and their right to self-determination, political independence, territorial integrity, and national unity. Right? Similar arguments that are now made on behalf of the Palestinians. Right? The people of Vietnam or of Gaza are heroic. Their struggle is epic, a stirring and permanent reminder of the incredible spirit of which men are capable when they are dedicated to a noble ideal. While the United States or Israel, right, these are representatives of imperialism or neocolonialism. These are universal empires of evil. These are examples of rapacious imperialism. These are the common destroyers of peace and justice. These are the greatest threats to the world. Right? And you get critics frequently comparing Israel and the United States to Nazi Germany, suggesting that both countries are unprecedented in their imperialist aggression. In the course of history, there have been many cruel and rapacious empires and systems of imperialist exploitation, but none before have had the power at the disposal of the United States imperialists. Then, after 1967, for the first time, you get this widespread characterization of the Jewish state of Israel as an imperial power, right? A state at the time of about, 6 million people, akin to the United States in Vietnam. And this gives the Palestinian cause credibility. It's an ethical fight. It's a just fight. It's a holy fight. So left-wing intellectuals who, until 1967, supported Israel, now became supporters of the Palestinians. Right? And this was shifted because of the Vietnam War, which changed the political consciousness among Western elites into a much more anti-colonial communist direction. And so critics of imperialism would say, well, the use of terrorism and guerrilla warfare, this is the only logical response to overbearing imperialism. Right? So colonialism, it kindles the hatred of the civilian population. It makes civilians rebels. This determines the characteristic of the struggle. The colonialists, like Israel, the United States, might have the superior weapons, but the indigenous population will make use of its advantages of number. Right? And we should not expect a resistance movement or a terrorist movement when confronting an imperialist power like Israel or the United States. They should not be expected to comply with the requirements of distinction. They should not have to show that they are combatants, right? They don't have to wear a uniform. And so a people's war, a war of terror, a guerrilla war, this is a perfectly reasonable and justified and ethical and uplifting and holy response to imperialism. Now, it does lead to an obvious response. Right? If taking on the unity of an entire people, which holds the conventional army at bay, then the only anti-guerrilla strategy, anti-terrorism strategy that will work is the destruction of the enemy, of the entire people, of the civilians, of the women and children. So imperialism and neocolonialism will inevitably respond to a people's war of liberation with genocide. So the imperialists like Israel and the United States in this communist way of thinking, yeah, they may have the technology, they may have the more up-to-date weapons, and due to their aggressive imperial nature, they are going to be likely to commit genocide. And the Strategic Hamlet program, right, which was initially thought of as a pragmatic response to a guerrilla war, it becomes attacked in similar terms. Right? The people who carried out the strategic hamlets thought they were protecting the peasants, but they were really protecting the peasants from communism, from liberation. Right? They wanted to separate the guerrillas from their support, but this is all a juridical, illegal fiction. Right? So you've got the imperialists with their depredations of the strategic hamlet program, with their moats, their machine guns, their turrets, their patrols, their use of forced labor. These are nothing but concentration camps designed with genocidal intent. Now, commies will say, yeah, counterinsurgency is a result of a people's war. And just as previous international lawyers had warned, the legitimacy of the people's war is juxtaposed against the illegitimacy of an imperialist Nazi-like regime. And so when imperialists fight with counterinsurgency tactics, they are surely on the side of evil. They are betraying all the principles that the United States purports to uphold, or that Israel purports to uphold. Right? In the name of freedom, pregnant women are ripped open. Every American who voted Republican or Democrat shares the guilt of these deeds. America, the self-proclaimed champion of freedom, is out there torturing and killing women and children for the crime of wishing to go on living in their homes. And so too, Israeli critics of the policy of occupation feared that it would lead to the destruction of Israeli democratic values, and this will only lead to further resistance and repression. So the dominant perspective on the Israeli-Arab conflict is the communist, Marxist-Leninist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist perspective. So the immorality and illegitimacy of U.S. and Israel campaigns of counterinsurgency, right, is illegal now. Right? And so you get critics starting to make technical arguments that the bombing of civilians is a breach of the laws of armed conflict. And it's not true. Right? These arguments required some impressive interpretive work. You had critics of the United States trying to declare the use of napalm illegal. Now, most objective lawyers point out that there's absolutely nothing in the Nuremberg Principles or in the laws of war to confirm that bombing of civilians is illegal. But by the end of the Vietnam War, this language is increasingly taken on by supporters of American government policy as well as critics. Now, people in Israel who are trying to make the case for Israel argue, oh, the great care that Israel's taking to try to reduce civilian casualties. Israel's taking much more care than other nations have taken to reduce civilian casualties. And so even the most pro-Israel of supporters are taking on this language that the number one concern in war should be minimizing civilian casualties, even if that means risking the lives of your people's fighters. And so there would be arguments that this Israeli action or this American action, all right, it only caused a remarkably small number of civilian casualties, and it was certainly not disproportionate to a military advantage. So supporters of Israel and the United States have to fight on this communist battleground of ideas. So the growing outrage over the Vietnamese War shows a shift in the understanding of what constitutes legitimate and lawful war. So now you've got terrorism, guerrilla war, a people's war for liberation is now considered legitimate and lawful, and the counterinsurgency techniques employed against terrorism, they're now so illegitimate it becomes impossible to see them as lawful. Any attack on civilian, even when the civilians cannot be distinguished from combatants, becomes increasingly difficult to defend. And the limited protections that existed for civilians prior to the 1970s have been transformed. So now we've got a dramatic distinction between military and civilian objectives, and the protection of civilians becomes the number one task when you've got combatants going to war.
Substantial minority does, unlike in the case of race differences.
Yeah, and if they accepted hereditarianism about race, then presumably they would also they would universally accept it with respect to sex, and then at least we could have these conversations.
Yeah, that's true.
So, on my account, the feminization of institutions is something happening in parallel with, but is a separate phenomenon from Wokism. But perhaps we could solve both problems with hereditarianism.
It's possible, yeah. It would certainly. I can't see how it would hurt. So, what did you make of my third point, which was that elites have reasons other than their rejection of racial hereditarianism for being on the left, particularly in the US, and namely that it's dominant?
You know what's a big problem for an open-hearted, sherry guy like myself? Right, there are all sorts of problems that I have where I'm repeatedly doing something that I don't want to do. So sometimes I'm overly familiar because I'm a jovial, jocular guy, and sometimes I become overly familiar with people who take offense at my joviality and jocularity, and I then kick myself. Like, why did I do that? That was inappropriate. These people don't like that jocular tone that you take. But then if I share with people that this is a problem, I always get lectured. Watch it. You shouldn't be doing that. You got to stop that. That's wrong. Right, guys, just because someone confides in you a problem that they keep doing, right, telling them to stop doing it, is not helping them. Right? You're not advancing civilization. You're not advancing the sublime and the ethical and the holy by telling them what they already know. Right? Most of our moral problems are not a result of a lack of moral knowledge. It's not usually the result of a lack of will. It's a lack of efficacy. And telling someone to stop doing something that they keep doing, right? You're not doing them any favors, and then you're not doing yourself any favors because it's just obnoxious. And if you feel absolutely compelled to give unsolicited advice, just do it once, right? Don't repeat it. If you must give unsolicited advice, just give it to a person once and then drop it. Move on. That's it.